In this video, I'll be sowing 1,000 onions. I'll go through the whole process from sowing to planting, to taking care of them, weeding, and lastly harvesting. So without much further ado, let's get started. The variety I chose for this year is called Yellow Sweet Spanish. We've tried it in the past and it's worked very well for us. We sow the onions in these plastic trays and then leave them in our greenhouse. We fill the trays with aged mulch, which is usually about 2 to 3 years old, and we mix it with some other things like coconut, coir, or perlite. We use aged mulch for basically all our seedlings, and it works great because it has a lot of nutrients that all the seedlings need. I usually sow about 300 to 400 onion seeds per tray, and then I thin them out as they grow. I'm sowing these onions here in August, which is late winter in New Zealand. After about 3 weeks, here's what the onion seedlings look like. They aren't growing as fast due to it still being winter here, and with the low light hours, plants just don't grow that quickly. Here are the onions after 7 weeks, and as you can see, they are starting to grow quite vigorously as the weather is finally starting to warm up now. I prepared this bed earlier in the season with compost and chicken manure. We like to use chicken manure for onions as it has a lot of nitrogen, and nitrogen is very important when growing onions. I also added some blood and bone for extra nutrients. I'm planting these onions in an area where it receives around 8 hours of sunlight during the day. Growing onions this way is a fairly time-consuming way, as you have to separate and plant each onion individually, which can take a long time, but it has worked successfully for us, as direct sowing is not really a reliable option from what we've noticed, as the onions don't grow at an even rate, and they usually have poor germination rates. We also planted some onions in a bunch. Stay tuned to find out what happens to those ones. When planting onions, we usually just thin out all the smaller ones, all the ones that look a bit weak and thin, as usually from our experience they don't bulb up, and even if they do, they're very small and basically unusable as real onions. After planting, I just make sure to water them well and deeply. We also put up a netting to prevent the birds from coming in and digging them all up. I've planted onions in many areas of my garden and also in the community garden, as onions are very costly here in New Zealand and they can cost up to $12 a kilo. For the organic ones, that is. I made sure to plant all the seedlings in direct sunlight, meaning at least 7 to 8 hours of direct, unfiltered sunlight. We also pruned the onions slightly by removing all the dead or diseased leaves or any of the leaves that were drooping down. Trying to keep on top of the weeds was a bit of a mission, but every week we tried to remove as much of the weeds as possible. But at the end of the growing season, when the onions were finishing up and maturing, we couldn't be bothered. But the following season, if I were to plant onions, I'd definitely mulch them with straw or some other type of mulch to prevent weeds, because weeds was definitely one of the biggest issues for us when growing these onions. We began harvesting the onions in about 5 months. You can usually tell when onions are ready for harvest when their leaves start to turn brown, dry up, and flop downwards. Harvesting is definitely a way more rewarding task. I made sure to pick a dry day when harvesting the onions, which isn't very hard in the summer. Some onions do take up to 8 months until they're ready for harvesting, so you definitely have to be patient. As the onions were growing, we made sure to fertilize them with blood meal. We did this because blood has a very high content of nitrogen, which is perfect for the onions. We did this roughly about 2 to 3 times throughout the growing period, and it seemed to help them quite a bit. But
so
this is
these
quite
here are
important,
some
as
of
the
the
skins
onions
of the
we
onions
have
need
planted.
to stay dry if they are to be stored for future use. Onions, depending on the variety, can last for a long time and well into the winter season. But this is quite important, as the skins of the onions need to stay dry if they are to be stored for future use. Onions, depending on the variety, can last for a long time and well into the winter season. Some onions do take up to 8 months until they're ready for harvesting, so you definitely have to be patient. So this here is the final harvest of the onions that came out of this small patch. And I'm actually pretty happy with the result, as you can see, the onions are pretty decent size. Well, there are also like smaller ones, but we're not complaining at all. It's a very good harvest. And the variety is called Yellow Sweet Spanish. We've tried it in the past, and last year it's also worked really well for us. So in the coming years, we'll probably continue to use this variety.